All righty, hi y'all. How we doing? Good. So, for weeks, we've been dealing with doctrine, with theology, and I think you guys know how much I love that stuff. But the focus has been really that doctrinal study, and now we're going to turn our attention to something else that I love, and that's biblical studies. And so, best place to start that is the Old Testament. So in the 2nd century, there was a theologian from the city of Sinope. Sinope is right on the Black Sea, the northern coast of Turkey. It's, if you look, it kind of sticks right out there. And he thought and taught that the God of the Old Testament was literally a different deity than the God of the New Testament. He was a lesser deity. He called him the demiurge, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with that term, but the demiurge is sometimes called the architect of the universe, the one who built and designed the universe, but he doesn't really like what he built, and so he's mean and he's vindictive. And then you get to the New Testament and you have Jesus, the Son of God, but Jesus is the son of a different God, according to Marcion. And so he runs into a problem, though, because he says the Old Testament needs to be rejected as Christian scripture. But what's his problem when he gets to the New Testament? Say that again? It quotes the Old Testament a lot. And he agreed that there is a messianic figure in the Old Testament that's talked about, but he said Jesus is not that. So he came up with his own scripture, his own Bible, if you will, and it consisted of highly redacted letters from about 10 of Paul's letters. He rejected 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and then the other 10 of Paul's letters, he highly redacted them. So basically what he did is he took out everything that didn't align with what he already believed, and then he had a highly redacted version of the Gospel of Luke, which he called the Gospel of Marcion. And so he comes up with this teaching, and he was sharply criticized by some of the early guys we call the church fathers, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and a bunch of others. In fact, none of Marcion's writings exist except that they are quoted extensively by these other guys. So we know what he wrote because of the quotes that we have by him. He planted a bunch of churches, and they don't exist today. I mean, they just didn't make it. Now, I think most Christians today would reject Marcionism. They would reject his ideas that it's a different God in the Old Testament. But I'm going to suggest to you that I think a lot of Christians today are what I would call practical Marcionites. In other words, Marcionites in practice. I think most Christians don't read the Old Testament. I think most Christians are a little intimidated by the Old Testament. And I think there are reasons for that. And I also hear Christians talking about, when they, there's a major disaster or something like that. Oh, man, that's Old Testament stuff right there. And so there's this perception that God is different, God is meaner in the Old Testament. But the Old Testament is fully 2/3 of our Bible. That's 2/3 of the Bible. But it's often neglected. Why do you think the Old Testament is often neglected? What are some reasons for that? I think there are a lot of reasons. What?
The law.
What about the law?
Moses taught eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth.
Okay, so there's this law, and it seems to contradict Jesus, right? And there's a perception that the Old Testament taught that a person is saved by the law, which the Old Testament doesn't teach that. But there's this mindset that, that's all law and rules and regulations, and the New Testament is all about grace and love and forgiveness. What are some other reasons people would neglect the Old Testament. You know, annually I do a Bible reading plan, and so this week I've been reading from 2 Kings and Isaiah. Well, so I was reading some in Isaiah. I've been reading Kings, and I go to read Isaiah. Now I've got Kings, and this morning I actually had some Kings and some Isaiah, because these things overlap and they happen in different places, and they're grouped according to category more than chronology in a lot of ways. What else are you going to say, Andy?
Well, I just think sometimes the context, we have difficulty understanding the context, and we say,
We do. I mean, we're so much further removed. I mean, you know, Abraham lived 3,000 years ago. King David, well, no, David lived 3,000 years ago. Abraham lived 4,000 years ago or more. And so it's much further removed than the Old Testament. And also, it is we wouldn't call it it's a Middle Eastern culture, but the technical term is it's an ancient Near Eastern culture. And when we get to the New Testament, even in Israel, a lot of the stuff we run into had been highly westernized. And so the Greek language is a lot more similar to English than the Hebrew language. So it's further removed from us in a lot of ways. What else?
The violence.
The violence. By the way, how much violence is there really? If you look at all of the Old Testament, there's not that much. I mean, you look at the period of Judges. I mean, Judges is one book, right? You look at the conquest of Canaan, that's one very brief episode. But there's at least a perception of violence.
Another might be the appearance of archaeology disagreeing with the Bible on a number of places.
Yeah, you know, you can go visit a lot of the places of the New Testament, but you visit fewer places of the Old Testament because they're much older, so they're gone, and the Romans didn't preserve them, you know. Yeah. The culture is very different. I think a lot of people fail to see the relevance of the Old Testament. I think also a lot of the Old Testament is poetry and prophecy, which is just not as easy to read as a letter or a gospel. You know, reading Luke is easier than reading Isaiah. And, you know, it's not as hard to figure out. I think there's also just a general unfamiliarity with it.
genealogy, there's a lot of genealogy.
There's genealogies in there, and what's the point of all that? And why do I need to know how many of this tribe and that tribe there were? And so we get bogged down in stuff like that. I think one of the reasons for the unfamiliarity is, and this has been documented, that the Old Testament is preached a fraction of the amount of time that the New Testament is preached, with the exception of a few select places. And I'll just tell you, one of the reasons that is you give me one of Paul's letters, and that's like preaching 101. You know, here's some stuff to believe and here's some stuff to do. It's a lot, you know, you give me like Ephesians, that's a lot easier than preaching Isaiah. I mean, you know, I preached Isaiah. It was hard. And there's a lot of homework goes into preaching Isaiah. And so, you know, I just think there's this general unfamiliarity. And so we're going to spend some time looking at the Old Testament. And I don't know how much time yet. And I'll explain that in a second. But, you know, the Old Testament is where we're introduced to God. I mean, that's where we meet Him. And really, that's where we're first introduced to Jesus. And the Old Testament provides the theological foundation of our faith and the groundwork for the gospel. The Bible's this grand narrative. It's one big story. And the truth is, the New Testament is not really going to make complete sense without the Old Testament. That's why you have all the quotes in the New Testament and references in the New Testament to the Old Testament, because it's built on the Old Testament. And at the same time, once you're reading the whole Bible, the Old Testament makes a lot more sense in light of the New Testament, because the New Testament's explaining a lot of the Old Testament. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to do some background of the Old Testament, big picture stuff. setting. Where did stuff happen? Some major themes. I'm looking at 3 major themes. I may bring a 4th in there, but I'm looking at 3 major themes right now, and then a brief overview of it. And then we're going to go into so this would be called Old Testament background, but then we're going to go into Old Testament survey. And so that's where we're going to kind of we're not going to walk through the Old Testament. We're going to sprint through the Old Testament. And that's where I'm not sure how much time I'm going to spend there. How many of y'all were here back when I preached the series Route 66, where I did a different book of the Bible every Sunday? I'm not going to do that. Okay, we're not going to do that. But what I probably will do is just like talk about the main themes in each of the books. I'm not, I work on this week to week, and so I'm not there yet. So we'll look at the main divisions in the various books. I do want to recommend a couple of things for you. And look, I know books are really expensive, and so I recommend these things. I will tell you, these 2 books are in our church library. But if you can afford it, I've said this before, but I think every home ought to have a Bible handbook. This is the Holman Bible Handbook. It's actually an old one. I think there's a newer version. But a Bible handbook actually takes you through and gives you an overview and outline of every book of the Bible. And so if, well, I'm going to read Matthew next. Okay, well, take one of these and go through and just kind of see. It's not really a full commentary on the Bible, but it is a helpful tool. And then I would say that's more important than this, but I think a survey of the Old Testament as well as a survey of the New Testament is a good thing. And so what this is like pulling the Old Testament out and giving you more detail and more of the archaeology and the background and the stuff like that. And this is one by Hill and Walton, which I think is a useful tool. And so those are just a couple of my recommendations about that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to think about and look at, we're going to do maps tonight. We're going to do a lot of maps tonight. The geography of the Old Testament. Where did all this take place? And one of the difficulties with that is that where something is in one book of the Old Testament isn't necessarily where it is in another book of the Old Testament. Because what I mean by that is territories, borders would move around. And what it once was this country now is this country. And so I'm going to kind of tonight go through, I'm going to put a bunch of maps up and just kind of walk through the timeline of the Bible with these maps. It can't be exhaustive just because y'all wouldn't sit here for all of that, and I don't have I'm not inclined to do all that. But the first thing is we would start with where it all began. And we don't know where the Garden of Eden was, okay? So I hesitated to put this map up. You see it's got question marks there. But when we read about the Garden of Eden, we read about 4 rivers. And who can name the 4 rivers? What? Euphrates? The Tigris? What are the other 2, y'all? What? All right. Somebody look it up. Where are you going to find that?
Is that the one in Babylon? Goes to
Here's the deal. We have no idea where they are. We have no idea where they are.
river.
But we have 2 places that are possibilities because of the convergence of the Tigris and the Euphrates. By the way, those 2 rivers are the Pishon and the Gihon. And so this may be where Eden was, but also what was the world like before the flood? Very different. Were these 2 rivers in the same place, or did they name these 2 rivers those names after the flood, even though those weren't the rivers? So we just have a lot of unanswered questions. But you're going to see over here is where Canaan is, and this is where modern day Israel is today. And one of the things I just wanted to point out to you is you're going to see, I want you to see why this was such disputed territory all the time. Now bear in mind, in ancient history, territory was always disputed and people were always fighting over land, but this was prime real estate. And there are some reasons for that. you see that the words here, Fertile Crescent, that's because where the water is where the green stuff is. And so because of the shape there, that's referred to as the Fertile Crescent. But down here is Arabia and Egypt. And I want you to see that Canaan is the crossroads, because if you're going to go from here to here, you're typically not just going to head across the Arabian desert, because that's hard. And so people are going to journey along the Fertile Crescent. And if you're going to go into Western Europe, you're going to come up and go that way. And so Canaan is strategically located. It's really this crossroads for anybody going from south to north or northwest and northeast. If you wanted to go that direction, I mean, you've got water here and water there. This is the direction you're going to go. So this is great real estate. Not only that, you've got the Mediterranean here, which opens up the sea to northern Africa and southern Europe. And so it's just a perfect location, especially in the ancient world, for trade to happen and for money to be made. And one of the things we learned, you know, Terry and I went to Israel for the first time a year and a half ago. How many of y'all have been to Israel? Anybody been over there? Terry and I couldn't believe it, because really north of Jerusalem, we just kept looking around going, it really is a land flowing with milk and honey. I could not get over how lush and beautiful it was. And the fruit trees, and I mean, it was remarkable. And so this is prime real estate, and that's going to come into play throughout the Bible there. Next, you know, we move into God calling Abraham. And Abraham is from a place called Ur. And so Ur is over in this region. And we read that he and Terah had moved to Haran. Okay? So he and Terah had moved to Haran, and Dad's name was Haran. And so they're living there, and it's a little confusing to me. Was he still in Ur when God called him? It kind of seems to me like it was. But at some point, God told him, you're going to leave your family, you're going to leave your people, and you're going to go to a land I will show you. Now, this is remarkable to me, because Abraham packs his stuff up and goes. Where are you going? I don't know. God's going to show me. And God showed him, and God brought him down. And he pitched his tent, and he hung out here for a while. And then God said, pack up. You're not. Well, God told him, this is the land. This is the land of promise. But pack your bags, because you're leaving for a while. And they went down to Egypt. And then they came back. And it was difficult. But, you know, we marvel at Abraham's faith, because he just went. And by the way, these aren't great distances when we think of traveling today, because it's really easy to jump in a car or an airplane. I mean, when, you know, I found out Bailey was in labor 2 Sundays ago. I have a friend with an airplane. I ran out to the airport. I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and at before 9 a.m., I'm landing in New Orleans. I mean, it was great. You don't do that back here. You're on foot. They're walking, and so this was tough. But this is where they are. So they did wind up down in Egypt. And again, this is a brief overview, just trying to give you highlights. But they wound up in Egypt. They ended up settling in Egypt, and the Israelites ended up settling, I don't know if you can see right up here the word Goshen, just east of the word Egypt. But that's where they settled. And this is just a map. By the way, I pulled all of these maps out of the digital ESV Study Bible. I highly recommend the ESV Study Bible. It is a great resource. And one of the great things about it, it's got some of the best maps I've seen. I mean, these are really good. And what this does is it's got, you can see, I don't know if you can read the legend, but it's possible routes of the Exodus, traditional route of the Exodus. We're not sure exactly where, but we know they wound up somewhere on that peninsula down there. And that's where Mount Sinai was. And of course, they end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And when you hear wilderness, you know, I think it depends on where you're from, what you think wilderness is. You know, if you're from East Texas, you might think of piney woods and being out in the wild. But this was harsh desert land. And that's why God had to provide water for them miraculously and food for them miraculously, because it's not an easy place to live. So they eventually get to go into the Promised Land. And when they go into the Promised Land, this just gives you an idea of where the tribes settled. Now, a couple of interesting things about the tribes settling in the land is there are 12 here, but Levi, the descendants of Levi, didn't get any land. Why? They're priests. So there were priestly cities they got to live in, and the people supported the Levites because they were doing their priestly work. But we read over and over God telling them, the Lord is your inheritance. You don't get any land, but the Lord is your inheritance. But there's still 12 tribes. So there were 12 sons, 12 tribes. Levi didn't get any land. So why are there 12 different tribes up here?
Joseph's son.
Who said, what about Joseph?
Joseph's son.
So Joseph actually got a double portion. So you got Ephraim and Manasseh. And so you actually see up here, Ephraim is right in here, and then you've got West Manasseh and East Manasseh, because before they crossed into the Promised Land, the leaders of Reuben, the leaders of Gad, and the leaders of Manasseh came and said to Moses, we like the land over here. Can we just stay here? And the other leaders said, whoa, we're going to war and you're just going to stay. And they said, no, we're going to go to war with you. And after you get to settle, we would like to come back over and settle in this land. And so Reuben, Gad, and then half of Manasseh settled on the east side of the Jordan River. Another interesting thing here, we're going to consider the divided monarchy in a minute, where there were 10 tribes in the north and 2 tribes in the south. And the 2 tribes in the south were Judah and Benjamin. But what do we do with Simeon down here? By the way, Simeon got the worst land of anybody. I mean, it's like God tells Simeon, yeah, you're going to go up and get to conquer the Promised Land, and then I'm sending you back to the desert, buddy. And he is surrounded. I mean, so Judah gets all of this, and Simeon is down here. So whatever happened to Simeon? Whatever happened to the Simeonites? And it's a big question, but the general understanding among Jews is they didn't like it here very well. And so a lot of them actually ended up moving north and settling among their brothers in other places. And so they just kind of went and blended in. And
Did the same thing moving north from their location.
Dan did the same thing. So here we are, the initial allotments, and of course, you know, this is as close as we can get, and we've got pretty good descriptions in the Bible, but it didn't stay like that. And the period of Judges is what comes next, which is just this repeated cycle of God's people going and doing their own thing, and we're told everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and so God brings the Philistines or somebody in to just conquer them, and then they would cry out to God, and God would hear their prayers, and he would raise up a judge, and the judge would lead them to victory, and they would have prosperity, and the next generation would come along, and they wouldn't serve the Lord, and each person would do what was right in his own. So it's just this period of continual turmoil, war, territories lost and regained. But then the people wanted a king, and they got one. And this is what we typically refer to as the United Kingdom, not the British United Kingdom. This is the United Kingdom, and what you can see here with these territories is that this gray area here is the part that Saul, the first king, controlled. Then the green part is the part that David ended up controlling, and then Solomon branched out a little bit and had a little bit more territory. This only lasted for 3 kings because there was some strife. There's always strife. In fact, when people say, man, things are worse today than they've ever been, I say, go read the Bible. There's nothing new under the sun, and it was always bad, and there were always problems, and a lot of those problems were in the family. So Solomon wasn't as wholehearted, devoted to the Lord as David was, and we all know David was kind of a mess too, in a lot of ways too. But one of Solomon's sons, Rehoboam became the king. And well, let me back up a little bit. There was a guy named Jeroboam, and Jeroboam wanted to be the king, and he tried to usurp David and almost made it, but David ended up seeking to kill him, and so he ended up escaping and running away. He went to Egypt or not David, but Solomon. Solomon wanted to kill him, so he goes to Egypt until Solomon dies. So Rehoboam becomes the king, and the people came to him and said, hey, your dad put a heavy burden on us with taxes and the work he had us do, and can you ease our burden? And so Rehoboam did something super smart. He went to his father's advisors, the old wise men, and the advisors said, lighten their load. You lighten their load, these people will follow you anywhere. If you're good to them, they'll be good to you. And then he went and got his buddies. And he said, well, this is what the old men said I should do. What do y'all think? And his buddies said, you tell them you hadn't seen anything yet. I'm about to bring the hammer down. My father beat you with whips, I'm whipping you with scorpions. And so the people were very, very unhappy under Rehoboam, and Jeroboam capitalized on this. Jeroboam came back from Egypt, and he ended up leading the discontent people into rebellion, and the kingdom was divided. And so now we have a northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. So after the kingdom is divided, you read about the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And it's really interesting because when you read 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, it's really great because when they're recording this, they will tell you, like in the 3rd year of this person, the king of Judah, this person became king of Israel. And then they'll come back around and say, in the 14th year of this person, king of Israel, this person became king of Judah. And so we have really, really accurate records. And we know exactly when these kings served and how long they served. So you've got the 10 tribes to the north and the 2 tribes to the south. You've got Israel and Judah, and God continues. So they've got kings now. And so God started raising up men that we know as the prophets. And the prophets didn't come into their office by birth like the priests did, but the prophets were each specifically directly called by God and given their ministries. And just, I thought this was a cool map because it can be confusing a lot of times when you're reading a prophet. You're like, who's he talking to? Is this northern kingdom, southern kingdom? When is this? And so you see some things. So this is either their birthplace or primary area of ministry, like Jonah up here in the north from Gath-Hepher. Jonah didn't prophesy there. He was sent to Nineveh to prophesy, but that is where he's from. And so this is helpful to see. And some of these prophets, they had the ear of the king. In fact, you know, where I'm reading right now is when Hezekiah is fearful of the Assyrians, he sends word to Isaiah and says, hey, what do I do? And when Hezekiah gets sick, he sends word to Isaiah and says, hey, can you plead to the Lord on my behalf? And so a lot of these prophets had the ear of the king, and a lot of the prophets the kings didn't like them very well at all. In fact, you think about Elijah the Tishbite, so he's from this place called Tishbe, which is somewhere in this region, and he spoke to the northern kingdom. And who was the wicked king up there? Ahab. It was Ahab. And you might remember one time that Elijah said, go tell Ahab I want to talk to him. He just didn't say that to the king because Ahab hated him. But Ahab came out and says, is that you troubler of Israel? And Elijah said, I'm not the one troubling Israel, you are. And man, just toe to toe with him. And some of them got killed for it. Jeremiah had a hard time. And in fact, he had such a hard time. He was persecuted so severely. He actually says to God at one point, God, you deceived me. and I was deceived by you. And he says, you called me to preach to these people, and for 23 years, I've been preaching, and not one of them has listened. He says, I don't want to do it anymore, but if I say I won't, your word is like a fire shut up in my bones. I'm weary of holding it in. I mean, he's mad. Why'd you call me to this ministry? And God used him, but it was hard. It was a hard ministry. But the prophets came a lot of times with a lot of encouragement, like when the Assyrians came to lay siege to Jerusalem, and Isaiah comes and says, look, don't give in to them. Just trust the Lord. Just trust the Lord. He's going to deliver you. And this is how he's going to deliver you. He's going to put a rumor in the king's ear, and the king is going to leave with his troops, and he's going to kill a bunch of the troops, and then the king's going to die. And they got up the next morning, there's 185,000 of the Assyrians dead. And the king had gone home, and 2 of his sons came and killed him. So encouragement. There's a lot of promise. You see a lot of messianic promises from the prophets. You also see rebuke and warning, and you see the warning like about the Babylonian captivity. But with those warnings always came, but then I'm going to bring you back. I'll bring you back. And eventually the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria in 722 BC. And just to give you an idea of who the Assyrians were, the Assyrians were a pretty big deal. And their strategy when they came in and conquered the northern kingdom, by the way, it wasn't just the northern kingdom that had a hard time. I mean, the southern kingdom had a hard time with the Assyrians, and at times even paid tribute to them and were afraid of them. And, Hezekiah in 701 or whatever that was, when they came and laid siege to Jerusalem, I mean, they were harassing them all the time. But what they did there, and I'll get to Babylon in a second, but their strategy was a little different than Babylon. So the Assyrians came in and said, their thing was, we don't want to conquer people and leave them to have their own identity where they're going to rise up against us again. So what they did is they would deport and resettle the Israelites all through their kingdom, and then they resettled people from their kingdom into Israel, and they all intermarried. And by the way, this is where the Samaritans come from. And this is why the Jews hate the Samaritans, or hated the Samaritans, because the Samaritans were the half-breeds. They weren't the pure-blood Jews anymore. Well, Assyria, as all these kingdoms do, eventually went into decline, and Egypt, they had control. So their territory extended down into Arabia, but they still controlled Egypt. Egypt was one of their vassal states, which I'm actually going to talk more about next week. But Egypt rebelled, Babylon rebelled, and Judah ended up rebelling against them and asserted their independence and said, we're not paying you for protection anymore. We're not going to be a part of your kingdom. And by 612, Babylon, with the help of the Medes, had conquered Assyria. And this gives you an idea of the Median Empire, which eventually, I'm going to show you the Assyrian Empire in a minute, but the Persian Empire. The Medes ended up merging with the Persians. But the Persians were much, much more powerful and just sort of absorbed them. But this is the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar was he was a pagan. He was not a nice guy, but he was a remarkable ruler. And man, he built Babylon just to be this magnificent, the city of Babylon to be this magnificent city. And he had actually taken control of most of Judah by 597. And deported some of them to Babylon. But in 586, he actually came and wiped out Jerusalem. Broke down the walls, destroyed the temple, burned the city. Just laid waste to it. And then deported the majority of them. And then there was another deportation of some that they left there in 582. So there were basically 3 deportations. His strategy was different than the Assyrian strategy. He said, we're going to bring these people and we're just going to let them set up shop here in Babylon. But they still have to adapt to our culture, but we're going to let them be their own people. And so These folks were massive and they were powerful until they weren't. And even after the Jews were allowed to return, this is what, so what happened is that the Assyrians conquered Babylon in 539 BC. So the Babylonian Empire, and I tell you, this is just so remarkable. You see these massive, massive, powerful empires, and where are they? They're historical now. They don't exist. So you get the Assyrians, and and so essentially, the Assyrians were in control of that part of the world. And we're not going to get into this too much, but until the rapid expansion of Greece under Alexander the Great in the 4th century, the 300s BC, Greece just came in and just started taking names. I mean, they just taking people, and they did it very rapidly. But that is after the time of the Old Testament, and the Greeks were in control until they weren't. And the Romans defeated the Greeks in 146 BC. And of course, that'll take us up to New Testament times when we end up getting there. And so that was a lot, I know, and so I'm not going to give you any more tonight. But I kind of want to stop there with some of this stuff. I just want you to, in case you're unfamiliar, get acquainted with the where of the Old Testament. And again, if you have a good Bible handbook, it should have maps in it. An Old Testament survey will have maps. But I'm telling you, one of the best tools I own is an ESV Study Bible. And one of the things I like about the ESV Study Bible is it's got articles on doctrine and apologetics and all kinds of stuff. Does anybody have one in here? Anybody have an ESV Study Bible? A couple of you do. Do you love it?
Yeah.
I love it. I use it, daily. And so I really like it. So next time what we're going to do is we're going to look at major themes and just do a brief overview of the Old Testament as we transition into a survey of the Old Testament. So that's when we're actually going to go and we're going to look at all the books. What's this book about? What's that book about? But we'll do multiple books a night. So we're not going to be doing this for how many books in the Old Testament?
66.
39. 66 in the Bible. There's 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. So we're not going to do 39 weeks of it, all right? So, but we may do 5 or 6 weeks of an Old Testament survey. So we're going to, like I said, we're going to sprint through the Old Testament and just give you a little of that. Any questions tonight?
That book, The Survey of the Old Testament, is that a good resource for directing you on how to read the Old Testament chronologically? Or what would you suggest?
I don't know. Let me look. I'm not sure that it's actually going to be a good resource chronologically. What I would do is just say either Google, or if you have the Bible app, what's that called? Huh? No, not Bible. It's no. YouVersion. Yeah, it's just a little Bible and says Bible. They have reading plans, and just get search for a chronological reading plan. And that's the best way, I think, to go through that. Also, I use what's called the 5-day reading plan, which I love, because who hasn't missed a day from time to time? And so, you got you get 2 days where you can catch up. You don't fall behind as easily. So the 5-day Bible reading plan, 5-day reading plan is what it's called. You can Google that, and it is chronological through the Old Testament. The only thing they put Job at the end, and I think Job was earlier, but that's a small thing. Anything else? Yes?
Are there extra biblical texts that confirm the biblical geographies?
Extra biblical texts that can, yes. And I mean, so when we say extra biblical texts,
Not the Bible.
yes, but he means stuff that's not the Bible. A lot of what we're dealing with from Old Testament times is not actually like on parchment or whatever. It's in stone. And so they have found, they call them steles, S-T-E-L-E, and they'll be like these chronological records that they kept on stone, and they basically chiseled it in. And so we actually have a lot that backs up like that. And then a lot of what we get for confirmation for the Old Testament is they've actually dug up a lot of these cities. They found, so like Jericho. By the way, if you go to Jericho, it says oldest city in the world. It's over 10,000 years old. And I don't know how old it is, but that's their claim to fame. And it's in Palestine. And they found the old city of Jericho with the walls crumbled and fallen outward, just like the Bible describes. And there was fire, and I mean, it lines up beautifully. And so it's really interesting because there have been so many critics the last couple of hundred years as liberal theology arose. So, well, all these places, David didn't even exist, and there's no proof of all this. And archaeologists just keep uncovering, and they found inscriptions outside the Bible of King David right at the time he was supposed to have lived. And they found evidence of the Israelites living in Egypt, and just all kinds of stuff that's been backing up the Old Testament. And a lot of stuff that's lost to history, because that's a long time. But what they did is, if you've heard the word Tel, like Tel Aviv in Israel, the word Tel is a hill. And so what they would do is there would be a city that would be destroyed, like it would crumble, and so they'd say, well, hey, there's a nice hill for us to build the next city on. So they go build on it, and then they'd build another one. And so what they do is they start digging down, and they find, oh, here's a city that lived during this century, and then here's a city that was during this century. And you say, well, how do they know? And for one thing, they find inscriptions, but they also look at like their tools and their pottery and stuff and say, well, we know when they were using this kind of stuff. And it's really fascinating. I don't have the patience to be an archaeologist, but I really appreciate archaeologists and what they do. Because, you're thinking, oh, they go out and find all this stuff. Yeah. Very slowly. They'll sit in one spot for days with a brush, because they don't want to damage anything. And I would lose my mind doing something like that.
Yeah, Megiddo is probably the best tell in all of that whole area, because they've got like 25 civilizations.
Yeah, and I've been there, and it's really remarkable. And you get to go down through a water tunnel. And when I say tunnel, I'm not going in a close. It's big, like where they kept the water and stuff. But you're up really high there. It's beautiful, too.
I think it's one of Frank Turek's podcasts. He was interviewing some guy that's been living in Israel for 30 years, and he's an archaeologist. And he was talking about some of the finds, and said one of the big problems now is the modern archaeologists are not Christian.
Yeah.
And they don't look at it the same way as Christian archaeologists do. And said, a good example, I think, I'm not positive, but it may have been Jericho, that people have been looking for it for a long time. And the person that initially found it was a Christian that took the Bible and looked at the clues in the Bible and went right to it and found it in a 3-year period or something like that.
Interestingly, and so what you're saying is they're not even looking in the right places because they just discount the Bible. Interestingly, though, for non-Christian archaeologists who are in like Turkey and Europe, and Turkey is where Asia Minor, used to be called Asia Minor, and in Israel, is one of their primary sources is the book of Acts, because it is proven to be so accurate. And so even non-believers know that the book of Acts is a good historical record. But there have also been a lot of archaeologists who have converted because the evidence is right there. All right, y'all, well, let's pray and we'll finish. Lord, we are thankful for an opportunity to study your word and just to see how reliable it is and trustworthy, and to consider that all these things we read about are real events that took place in history. And I pray that you would use this time together as we look at these things just to draw us closer to you and give us more awe of who you are and help us to love you more and to worship you better. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for coming, y'all.